Hello. I'm presenting our paper today, Revolting from Abroad, the Formation of a Lebanese Transnational Public. To begin with, I would like to give you a historical glimpse of the context of Lebanon. Lebanon has been through a civil war that started in 1975 and lasted for approximately 15 years. This civil war was mainly because of sectarian division and further exacerbated those divisions across the country and led to severe outcomes such as a high number of casualties, the destruction of infrastructure and welfare systems, and subsequently led to a forced migration. Over the years, the Lebanese diaspora kept growing in numbers and played a pivotal role in the development of Lebanon through investments, philanthropy, and significant financial remittances, which are the primary source of foreign currency into the country. Over the years, members of diaspora were targeted by political parties for election purposes, but they were never in direct friction with the prevailing political and economic system. Zooming in to the Lebanese revolution, it was the result of multiple factors and circumstances. Over the years, there was a buildup due to the institutionalized sectarianism that was a result of the civil war, the corruption, clientelism, and inadequate economic policies, and the fragmentation of public services and social welfare. Over the years, there were multiple attempts for social movements led by young activists and civic groups due to an array of reasons related to political, social, and economic events. However, a lot of those attempts were short-lived and never really led to significant changes on the ground. However, in summer 2019, there were several triggers, such as the inadequate governmental response to wildfires that erupted in the mountains of the country. Commercial banks started exerting capital control on depositors. There was a depreciation of the local currency and a sharp decline in the state services and welfare, and changes in taxation policies. All of that led that in October 2019, a revolution erupted. We use the term revolution, which comes from the Arabic word sawra, which is the terminology used by actors on the ground, which also means outburst. And as it states, there was indeed a popular outburst on the streets, such as street protests, but also reclaiming public squares for dialogue and debate, installing community kitchens, and many grassroots initiatives and coordinated actions across the country were being organized for the first time, surpassing sectarian divisions. In order to frame our work, we looked at existing literature relating to social movements, diaspora communities, and network publics. Social movements are indeed a fertile ground for the creation of network publics by bringing together multiple stakeholders who engage together through digital means or through live interactions around a common cause or to contest the conditions that led to the movement to begin with. We relied on CSCHI's work and framing of network public, which refers to the reconfiguration of publics and movements through assimilation of digital technologies into their fabric. Focusing on diasporic communities, we noted that the mobilization and collective action of such communities create transnational publics. Both social movements and transnational publics are networks, but they differ based on identity, agency, and space. Therefore, it's really important to build an understanding of how such networks develop their internalities. And by internalities, a term that CSCHI coined, we're looking at processes relating to self-organizing, decision-making, and political debate, which are aiming towards changing narratives, impacting election outcomes, decision-making processes, and the disruption of the status quo. Therefore, we ask ourselves two research questions. First of all, how did the Lebanese diaspora self-organize, mobilize, and structure itself into a transnational public? And how did this transnational public interface with local actors as part of a wider social movement? In order to answer to such inquiries, we conducted our data collection through online mediums. We conducted online observation of different social media accounts, primarily on Facebook and Instagram. We joined multiple WhatsApp groups that were part of the revolution. We attended online webinars, talks, and discussions, and we interviewed members of the diaspora that acted either at the individual capacity or within organized groups. It's important to note that both me and my co-author Reem Talhouk are also part of the Lebanese diaspora, which facilitated our access to such communities and events. Based on our observations and our interviews, we were able to depict a transnational public, but also a multi-layered transnational public. As you can note from this figure, there are different layers to this public, starting off with the local actors working with different diaspora groups. Some of those diaspora groups were informal, meaning that they were not necessarily organizational. but they relied on tools such as WhatsApp to coordinate with local actors. On the other hand, there were also diaspora groups that were more formal because they registered themselves either as an NGO or as a local company in order to deliver and plan events and interventions. These kind of groups were actually more structured, and they relied on organizational tools such as Slack, for example, WhatsApp and Facebook, to be able to communicate, organize, and plan events with local actors. In addition, we have diaspora individuals, which acted at the individual capacity, which were also working with local actors, but also working with diaspora groups, forming another layer of the public. Those members either organized their own fundraising initiatives or relied on tools such as Amazon in order to support efforts on the ground. And bigger than all of that is the wider transnational public that encompasses all those layers, which includes the local actors working with different diaspora groups, the diaspora groups themselves being a public, and then the diaspora individuals working with both local actors and diaspora groups. So it was a quite complex networked public, which had different layers, different actors, and different tools, depending on who were the actors using them. There were multiple challenges encountered due to the complexity of such a public. First of all, building trust, because there was a proliferation of groups and grassroots initiatives, and there wasn't necessarily a clear identity and values of the individuals behind them. There was an issue of securing funding and donations because there were many restrictions by commercial banks and even technical constraints related to the fundraising platforms that were being used. There was also a mismatch between online organization and activism and offline actions. So you would often see a lot of efforts being coordinated online through events, through talks, through conversations, but they were not necessarily matched by protests on the ground in Lebanon. There was also, more significantly, a clash between the diaspora's agenda and local actors' agenda. The diaspora members were often perceived by local actors as being tokenistic and trying to impose Western values on the Lebanese context. On the other hand, diaspora members felt that the Lebanese members were being fragmented in their efforts. There was a certain trust issue relating on how funds were being used on the ground, and were not necessarily capturing the complexity of what was happening on the ground. Based on all of that, we can note that, first of all, the decentralization and the flexibility were core elements that implied the success of this multi-layered transnational public. There was a very noteworthy socio-technical bricolage that was happening by the reappropriation of existing technologies for different purposes, and specifically to enable, sustain, and propagate political action with and for the revolution, as I mentioned earlier, through the use of different tools, either for communication, organization, mobilization. The use of certain digital platforms, specifically for funding, reinforced power asymmetries between diaspora members and local members. This is because those platforms were not supported in Lebanon, and the diaspora members had to control who had access to such funds and had to organize the fundraising efforts. In addition, within transnational network public, there's a need for design that facilitates negotiation of different political values that will enable us to construct a narrative that is inclusive and representative of all actors, and not necessarily having one group imposing their values on others. There's a need also to design crowdfunding technologies, specifically in such contexts of messiness, that are responsive to the realities on the ground. And it's not just about raising the funds, but also ensuring the collection of such funds is done with transparency, and also the allocation of such funds is done with accountability. If you would like to know more in depth about the work that we did, I encourage you all to read the paper for more details, as I wasn't able to cover all the elements in this short presentation. Thank you so much for listening.